Heroes of Israel by William Garden Blaikie. Chapter 5. Return to Canaan, Separation from Lot. Genesis chapter 13. Notwithstanding all that he had lost by the effects of the, quote, grievous famine, end quote, Abram prospered again, and with his resources greatly increased through the profane liberality of Pharaoh, who had scorned to take back what he had once given, returned to, quote, the south, end quote, very rich in cattle, in silver, and in gold, end quote. But he does not seem to have lingered in, quote, the south, end quote, the neighborhood of Beersheba and Hebron. Quote, he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar, which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. End quote. There is great significance here in the expressions, quote, at the beginning, end quote, at the first, end quote. They shadow a state of mind delineated very vividly by the prophet Hosea, when, after unholy endeavors to better her condition, the backsliding wife returns to her first husband, quote, for then it was better with me than now, end quote. Or that of the prodigal son resolving, quote, I will arise and go to my father, end quote. Abram had not gone so far aside as either of these, but he is eager, in more senses than one, to be back where he was. He sees that he has made a mistake. That journey to Egypt should never have been undertaken. He should have remained where he was, trusting his flocks to God. And now he seems eager to retrieve his error, desirous, as far as he can, to erase an unfortunate chapter from his life, to tear out a blotted leaf, and begin again as before. It goes without saying that his spiritual life had suffered by that visit to Egypt. His deceit, his distrust, his selfishness had made a gulf between him and his God. He sighs now for the happiness and peace of former days, and with the hope that the old place would help to bring back the old feeling, that the hallowed associations of former days would facilitate the return of communion with his Father. He goes back to the place of the altar which he had made there at the first, and calls upon the name of the Lord. And if we may judge from his future conduct, he did not call in vain. Personally, he seems to have regained his old place side by side with God, but the effects of his error on others do not appear to have been so easily rectified. A good man may err, may conform to the world, may engage in a lucrative but pernicious business, without sacrificing his own standing with God. But what of his son? What of his nephew, whom he has brought up to the business, whom he has initiated in his ways? It is here that the nemesis of providence often appears. The father or uncle may keep his position. The son or nephew slips and falls. The devil gets a foothold at the very beginning, and he speedily improves it to gain the whole man. We cannot affirm with certainty that the visit to Egypt increased the worldliness of Lot, or that the eclipse of Abram's faith was followed by a profounder eclipse of his nephew's. But this coincidence is remarkable, for there came now a decisive moment in Lot's life, and he did not act like a man of God. All this time Abram had been accompanied by his nephew. Though constantly together, the two friends kept their establishments apart, having separate flocks and herds, and separate herdsmen to look after them. And now the cattle had grown to such numbers that it was no longer convenient for them to remain together. Strife arose between their servants. The better and more convenient pastures would naturally be sought by both, and the contention evidently rose to an unbecoming warmth. Its effect on the native inhabitants was not edifying. Abram could not bear that the Canaanite and the Perizzite should see them quarrelling. He had been sufficiently humiliated in Egypt by the king's rebuke of his unworthy artifice, and by the thought that the worshipper of the true God had appeared in a more unworthy light morally than the inhabitants of the country. Such a thing must not occur again. At any sacrifice, his strife with Lot must be brought to an end. Abram is himself again, and now he acts with a magnanimity which is just as striking as his deceit and selfishness in Egypt were pitiable. As the elder of the two, the uncle of Lot, the leader of the enterprise, and, above all, the man to whom God had revealed himself and to whom he had promised the land, he might most reasonably have demanded the first choice if the two establishments were to be separated. But peace and a good example to the natives were more to him than convenience or gain. His personal interests do not count in the matter. Well would it have been had all settlers in new countries been as careful of the moral impression of their actings on the natives. With Abram we naturally couple men like William Penn, who was so careful in the settlement of Pennsylvania to do nothing unworthy in the eyes of the natives, so eager to give them an impression of Christians as men, quote, that did justly, that loved mercy, and that walked humbly with their God, end quote. So Lot gets the first choice and finds the whole land before him. In the neighborhood of Bethel there rises one of the highest hills in Palestine, commanding an extensive view. Dean Stanley describes the scene with his usual graphic power. Quote, from this height, Abraham and Lot must be conceived as taking the wide survey of the country, on the right hand and on the left, such as can be enjoyed from no other point in the neighborhood. To the east there rises in the foreground the jagged range of the hills above Jericho. In the distance the dark wall of Moab. Between them lies the wide valley of the Jordan, its course marked by the tract of forest in which its rushing stream is enveloped. And down to this valley a wide and deep ravine, now, as always, the main line of communication by which it is approached from the central hills of Palestine, a ravine rich with vine, olive, and fig, winding its way through ancient reservoirs and sepulchres, remains of a civilization now extinct, but in the time of the patriarchs not yet begun. To the south and the west, the view commanded the bleak hills of Judah, and in the far distance the southern range on whose slope is Hebron. Northward are the hills which divide Judea from the rich plains of Samaria. End quote. The locality in all this amphitheatre that fascinated Lot was, quote, the plain of Jordan, end quote. It was so rich and well watered, probably by artificial irrigation, that it looked like, quote, the garden of the Lord, end quote, and reminded him of the land of Egypt. But we must not take the description too literally, for there is no hill near Bethel where a full view may be got of the whole valley of the Jordan. The cliffs that rise on its western side prevent the valley from being properly seen. But whether Lot could see the Jordan Valley from Bethel or not, he must have known its distinguishing features, its great fertility, and its remarkable fitness for all agricultural and horticultural purposes. In those days, it was a more attractive and productive valley than it is now, but this may readily be understood. Contrasting its present condition with what it might yet be, the author of, quote, The Land and the Book, end quote, remarks, quote, Jericho was called the city of palm trees, but the one only palm that a quarter of a century ago stood, like a solitary sentinel, near the old tower is gone, and thus has passed away the last vestige of that great forest which gave name to the city. The forest, however, might be restored, and then the best dates would come again from Jericho. The soil and climate are admirably adapted to this tree, and, indeed, there is nothing required but cultivation and irrigation to make the whole plain of the lower Jordan fruitful as the garden of the Lord. Every acre of it might be watered from the strong brook in Wadi Kelt, from the great fountain Ez Sultan, from those of Wadi Duk, and from the Jordan itself. The valley of the Jordan could sustain 500,000 of inhabitants. Cotton, rice, sugarcane, indigo, and nearly every other valuable product for the use of man would flourish most luxuriantly. Now, how desolate and barren! Just around Ain Ez Sultan, and between it and Reba, the plain is covered with a forest of thorn trees. But look elsewhere, and the eye aches from the glare of naked sandfields glowing beneath a burning sun. End quote. We shall afterwards have occasion to inquire into the nature of the changes which this region underwent at the time of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Meanwhile, our business is with Lot and Abram. Lot in Scripture is called, quote, a righteous man, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 8. But he had the infirmities of his race. The temporal advantages to be enjoyed in a region so favoured by nature blinded him to the moral putridity with which it stank. One would have thought that such a place as Sodom was the last spot in creation where he would have thought of settling with his family of young daughters and all his servants, male and female, over whose morals he was bound to watch with pastoral care. But, on the one hand, the sin of the people was so common that it ceased to be thought much of. For in the moral, as in the material world, men may get used by a lapse of time to what is disgusting, so that it ceases to shock them. Moreover, greed seems to have been Lot's besetting sin. The vision of multiplied wealth not only dazzled but overcame him. It carried him captive, as helpless as if he had been in chains. There are lusts of such intensity that when the opportunity of indulging them starts up, conscience is paralyzed and all power of resistance vanishes. Such a lust was greed in the case of Lot. Nothing could carry him past the mine of gold which now lay at his feet. So Lot parts from Abram, his lifelong friend and companion, his spiritual father likewise in all probability, his guardian angel in many an hour of weakness, the best and noblest friend he could have had. It could not have been a happy parting. Lot could not have been unmoved at the loss he was about to sustain, and though he would not let himself think much of it, at the moral risk he was about to run, and Abram could not have been unmoved to see him descending into a society of unexampled impurity, accompanied by a wife who, whatever the good points of her character, was more likely to inflame than to check his worldliness, and who was capable of imperiling the moral welfare of her daughters for the sake of rich connections and splendid marriages. Of the previous history of the people of Sodom and the other cities we have little knowledge. Their genealogy is given in Genesis chapter 10, verses 15 to 20. But beyond the fact that they were Canaanites, and that their country was the limit of Canaanite territory on the southeast, we know nothing. Quote, "The border of the Canaanites was from Sidon, as thou comest to Gerar unto Gaza, as thou goest unto Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah, and Zeboim, even unto Lasha." End quote. Of this place, Lasha, which was the farthest limit of Canaanite territory, we have no knowledge whatever, unless it was another name for Zoar. The group of cities were 5 in number, each with a king or sheikh of its own. Sodom was evidently the foremost of them. It was, quote, toward Sodom, end quote, that Lot first pitched his tent. Genesis chapter 13, verse 12. Afterwards, he seems to have had his residence in the town. Chapter 19. Sodom seems to have excelled the other places in wickedness, for its name retains a special taint of infamy, and it was on it that the divine judgment fell first. There can be but one explanation of Lot's selection of it for his headquarters. The worldly advantage of its situation must have been greater than that of any of the other cities. Leaving Lot to enjoy his choice, if it was possible for him to do so, we return to Abram. It was not long before his generosity in giving Lot the first choice was rewarded, and a new reason presented to him for prizing the comparatively bleak hills about Bethel, where he was to remain. God renewed the promise and the covenant to him in a more specific form. He bade him, quote, lift up his eyes and look from the place where he was, northward and southward and eastward and westward, end quote, and promised him to give him all the land which he saw, to him and to his seed after him forever. Formerly he had promised to make him a great nation, but now he intensifies the language. Quote, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. End quote. And as if it were not enough to see the land with his eyes, he bids him, quote, arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. End quote. This was a very seasonable announcement to Abram. He had been accustomed hitherto to look on Lot's family as much the same as his own. Possibly, when no offspring was given to himself, the thought sometimes occurred, may not Lot be counted as my son? And may not the blessing come to me through him? If ever such a thought presented itself, it can be entertained no longer. It is not to Lot, who has now left him, but to his own seed that the land is to be given. And this gracious assurance of God further shows to Abram that, notwithstanding Egypt, God is reconciled to him, is still his friend. He is his covenant God as of old. Abram's generous readiness to let Lot have his choice is thus rewarded. Lot has chosen his corner, but it is not a corner that will be blessed. The whole land remains, and that is to become the property of Abram's seed. And Abram need have no scruple in going to whatever part of the country it suits him to go. If he prefers to go southward, by all means let him go. Encouraged by these gracious assurances, quote, Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain by the oaks, Revised Version, of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. End quote. This was the first consecration of Hebron. The most part of what remained of Abram's life was spent either there or at Beersheba, which was part of the district so well known in the Old Testament as, quote, Negeb, end quote, or, quote, the south, end quote. Hebron, sometimes called Mamre, after the chief man of the place, chapter 23, verses 17 and 19, afterwards attained to great and manifold distinction, first as the burial place of the patriarchs, afterwards as one of the cities of refuge, and finally as the first capital of the kingdom of David. In the time of Moses, it was an old city, quote, 7 years older than Zoan in Egypt, end quote. Numbers chapter 13, verse 22. It had probably been occupied by the founder of Egypt, Mizraim, in his migration southward, till, learning of still richer fields on the banks of the Nile, he had directed his course to Egypt and laid the foundation of Zoan, its earliest capital. It was halfway between Jerusalem and Beersheba, about 20 miles distant from each. A former name was Kirjath Arba, Judges chapter 1, verse 10. It was then the city of Arba, the father of Anak, the progenitor of the Anakim, the giant race of whom we hear so often afterwards. Its present name is El Khalil. Mamre, after whom both the city and the oak, which marked the place of Abram's encampment, was sometimes called, was an Amorite, the proprietor of the land in the neighborhood. If it be asked, how was Abram permitted to pitch his tent by the oak of Mamre, not only using Mamre's pastures, but the very spot which was preeminently associated with his name, it may be said that probably Abram in some way remunerated Mamre for this privilege, as he afterwards paid Ephron the Hittite a substantial sum for the ownership of the cave of Machpelah. But there is another consideration to be taken into account. The very presence of a man like Abram brought advantages with it in those wild times. If the servants of Nabal could represent to him the commercial value of David's presence in the neighborhood of Carmel, much more probably might Abram's neighbors feel that they were the better for him. When Isaac was in Gerar, the king and his officers went to him and urged him to make a treaty with them, because they saw that the Lord was with him. This may have been merely the result of a superstitious dread toward one who was evidently in partnership with the Almighty, but it counted for much on Isaac's behalf, and no doubt the same feeling prevailed towards Abram, and helped to secure for him that peaceful life at the hands of the native inhabitants which he appears uniformly to have enjoyed. Situated at the head of a valley, on a high tableland afterwards known as, quote, the hill country of Judah, end quote, Hebron was celebrated then, as it is still, for two things, the excellence of its pastures and the luxuriance of its vines. When Dr. Edward Robinson, the distinguished author of, quote, Biblical Researches, end quote, visited Hebron in 1838, he paid a visit to a chief who was residing by just such an oak as that under which Abram lived some 4,000 years before. Quote, the venerable oak, end quote, he says, quote, to which we now came is a splendid tree. We hardly saw another like it in all Palestine. Certainly not on this side of the plain of Esdraelon. Indeed, large trees are very rare in this quarter of the country. The trunk of this tree measures 22.5 feet around the lower part. It separates almost immediately into 3 large boughs or trunks, and one of these, again, higher up, into 2. The branches extend from the trunk in one direction 49 feet, their whole diameter in the same direction being 89 feet, and in the other, at right angles, 83.5 feet. The tree is in a thrifty state, and the trunk sound. It stands alone in the midst of a field. The ground beneath is covered with grass and clean. There is a well with water nearby, so that a more beautiful spot for recreation could hardly be found. Quote, I am not sure whether this is the tree which Sir John Mandeville saw near Hebron, of which he relates that it was green in Abraham's day, but dried up at the time of our Saviour's crucifixion, like all the other trees then in the world. This cannot be either the tree of Abraham or its successor, for his terebinth probably stood more towards Jerusalem, and had already disappeared in the days of Jerome." End quote. Thankful for so much mercy, Abram and Sarai pursued at Hebron the even tenor of their way, but under the silent restlessness of an unfulfilled hope. The flocks and herds would give full and interesting employment to the one, and the other would find an interest in her embroideries and other needlework, and in kindly attentions to her female servants and their children. But in both an unsatisfied heart hunger would ever and anon ruffle their tranquillity, nor could they be free from anxious thoughts about Lot and his family, all the more that they had appeared so little sensible of their spiritual danger, and so thoroughly captivated with the riches of Sodom.